Thank you, Joel. I'm really thrilled to be here. I'm particularly touched to be here in conjunction with the C.S. Lewis Institute because I do not think it is an exaggeration to say that I have quoted C.S. Lewis in every book that I have written. And where I have not quoted him, I have stolen all the good stuff in my books from him. And then about a year and a half ago, Timothy called me, and he had read The Radical Pursuit of Rest, which I was really excited about because that meant that somebody other than my wife had purchased the book. And as he talked about it, I was really impressed with not just the fact that he wanted to create a place of retreat, but that there was behind it an ethos of rest. And when we got here, my wife Jane and I, and saw the beautiful surroundings, we were just really moved by it. And in fact, we were staying over in the manor house, and I was trying to get a read of whether these people were serious, and I discovered that these people are really serious about rest. Because in the manor house, I discovered a room, the sole purpose of that room is rest. Now, I think the decorating in the room needs a little work. It's like there's a sink in there and a really weird looking chair, but anyways, okay, fine. As Joel said, I'll be completing 25 years of serving on the faculty at Moody Bible Institute in Chicago this year, and it's also going to be my last year. I announced that I'm going to be retiring at the end of the school year, and when I made that announcement, many of my colleagues asked me the same question. Almost everyone asked this exact question. They said, "So, John, what are you going to do next? Are you going to go back into the pastorate, or have you found another school to teach at, or what?" And I could tell that what they really meant was, what's your next job going to be? And when my answer seemed too vague and undefined, I could tell that it really made them agitated. It bugged them, it bothered them. And I don't have any doubt that those who pressed me on the matter were concerned for my well-being. And I am sure, since most of them are my friends, they were genuinely interested in what the next phase of my life was going to be all about. But I think that there was also something else at work. It seems to me that their response was indicative of a way of thinking about work that is very common. More than this, I think that it betrays a certain way of thinking about ourselves and our own value in a way that ties it to work. This mindset was epitomized by the remark of one of my colleagues who, after one of these exchanges, finally burst out and said, "Well, you can't just do nothing." Now, he didn't mean this as a statement about biology. He wasn't saying, "Well, John, even when you're not doing anything, you're still doing something. I mean, your heart is beating, you're breathing, your mind is active." He didn't mean it as a statement about physics. He wasn't saying, when your body seems to be at rest, did you know that it actually isn't at rest at all? Not completely. Your atoms are whirling and spinning. I think he meant it as a moral statement. He was saying, in effect, okay, so you're retiring. But it would be wrong for you to do nothing. So what are you going to do? What are you going to do to justify your existence? Now, this is a mentality that's reflected in that comment that I heard somebody make very soon after my book was published, The Radical Pursuit of Rest. They said, well, God's people don't need to hear about rest. They need to get busy. Now, I don't think he's alone in thinking that. Whether it's our careers, whether it's in our churches, whether it is in our spiritual lives, many of us operate on the same basic assumption that drives us. It is the assumption that in the Christian life, busier is better. This assumption, in turn, is based on a supposition which equates devotion with activity. The more we love Christ, the thinking goes, the more we'll do. Those who love Christ the most, whether they are individuals or whether they are churches, those who love Christ the most will do the most. Of course, there's a trap in that thinking. Since our devotion to Christ should know no bounds, then neither should our activity. That means that no matter what we are doing now, we will feel like we need to be doing more. He certainly deserves more, doesn't he? And no matter what we have done in the past, it won't be enough. The result of this kind of thinking is a driven church that is filled not with worshipers, but with workers. Workers who must constantly strive to exceed their current level of productivity. Like a salesperson who works for a demanding employer who keeps raising the quota. Or the child of a strict parent whose love must be earned, but who never seems quite satisfied with our effort. We are plagued by the gnawing conviction that whatever we're doing, we need to do more. Spiritual life has been reduced to work, and work has become an end in itself. In an editorial in Christianity Today entitled, "Whatever Happened to Grace?" Editor Mark Galley observes, "What I'm hearing time and again in every corner of the church I visit is not the soaring message of grace, but the dull message of works. That I have to believe a certain theological construct, or I have to have a certain feeling, or perspire in effort before I can be assured of God's radical acceptance and my future salvation." Now, we may not be legalists in the technical sense. We know that we're saved by grace. And yet, we also feel as if it is up to us to add value to what Jesus has done. I think this is often reflected in the church's preaching. In fact, I can tell you it was often reflected in my own preaching. As week after week, the pastor urges the congregation toward greater exertion. We're told that we must round the bases from mere attendance to full involvement in the life of the church. We're told that we are Christ's hands and feet. We're told that attending church is good, it's okay, but really it's not enough. We're told that fully devoted followers of Jesus join a small group. They engage in service projects. They serve in the nursery. They come out on weekends to rake leaves for the elderly. They spend their vacation doing short-term ministry. And of course, on top of this, responsible Christians are engaged with their community. They run for office, or they become political activists. They join the school board. They support the arts. And of course, it goes without saying that in all of this, real Christians keep the family as a top priority. And these Christians, if they're really mature, they are spiritually reflective. The time that they spend in God's Word should be measured in hours rather than minutes. They have read everything that C.S. Lewis has written and everything that has been written about C.S. Lewis. And then there is our ordinary work, our jobs. Well, actually, to tell you the truth, the church doesn't have much to say about our jobs. It may have something to say about what we do with our salary, but for some reason, our ordinary work is just kind of dead space to the church. It doesn't fall into any category that the church usually thinks about when it thinks about ministry. As a result, we are put in a very difficult situation. We're busy. Maybe busier than we have ever been. And yet we feel as if we are lazy. We are worn out. And yet at the same time, for some reason, we feel like spiritual deadbeats. In a climate like this, Jesus' invitation in Matthew 11, 28 through 30 must seem strangely out of sync with our Christian experience. Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. In a church culture which believes that busier is better, Jesus' invitation is a surprise. It may even alarm us. It might disturb us because it seems to say that busier is not better. Busier is not better because a busy faith is often a burdened faith. And Jesus' call is not a call to busyness, but to be unburdened. Notice those to whom Jesus addresses this invitation. He says, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened." He says in verse 28, this is a call to all who are weary, all who are burdened. But who are these people? What is the burden that they are carrying? Well, some scholars think that this is a call to those who were burdened by legalism, weighed down with the rules and the laws of their religious leaders. They think that Jesus is taking issue with Jewish legalism. This would have been the teaching of those who tried to protect the commands of the law of Moses by building a fence of additional commandments around it. Jesus describes them in Luke 11:45 when he says, "You experts in the law, woe to you! Because you load people down with burdens that they can hardly carry, and you yourselves will not lift one finger to help them." If this is the case, then Jesus was taking aim at the exhaustion that comes from taking on burdens that God never intended us to carry. It is the weariness of trying to live not by God's standard, but by someone else's. It could be a pastor's. It could be a parent's. It might even be my own standard. This is the burden of a spiritual life that is more about what we are doing than it is about why or who we are doing it for. Others say that the burden Jesus speaks of in Matthew 11 is more basic than that. It is simply the weight of sin. And sin does more than produce a burden. Sin is itself a burden. It's a burden that leaves us like Christian in John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, clothed in rags, with our face turned away from those who love us most and bearing the weight of our own iniquity. But when you think about it, sin and legalism, they are really just two sides of the same coin. Legalism is really just our inadequate coping strategy for dealing with the problem of sin. Legalism is a human attempt to rid ourselves of the burden that only Christ can remove. And that is the great irony of legalism. Those who try to find peace with God by trying to keep the rules end up no better than those who decide to live without the rules. Fortunately for us, Jesus issues this invitation to rule keepers and rule breakers alike. He offers his rest to all who are weary and heavy laden. And Jesus knows something about weariness. Jesus was a laborer. He was a carpenter and the son of a carpenter. Jesus knew the weight of a load. He shared the experience of everyone who plies a trade. Like us, Jesus knew what it was like to feel weary at the end of the workday. He was also a wanderer who knew the rigors of travel. It was Jesus who sat down by Jacob's well, tired as he was from the journey, according to John 4:6. But the weariness that Jesus speaks of in this invitation does not come from ordinary exertion. Common labor tires the body. But the weariness that Jesus is talking about here is one that afflicts the soul. And the surprising metaphor, frankly, the astonishing metaphor that Jesus uses to help us understand this is the yoke. It is a reminder that in the Christian life, busy is not necessarily better. Busier is not better because a busy faith is often a misdirected faith. A busy faith is often a misdirected faith. Busier is not better because when we make busyness our main goal, we tend to be busy about the wrong things. Jesus' invitation to rest in Matthew 11:28-30 is a call to be unburdened by taking up a different burden. Now, one reason that Jesus' invitation to rest seems counterintuitive is because it is a call to lay down your burden and take up his burden, something that he's going to give you. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, Jesus says in verse 29. Now, Jesus' listeners would have been well familiar with the yoke as an implement of agriculture. The yoke was a piece of wood shaped to fit over the neck of an animal who has been drafted to pull a heavy load. And Jesus himself might even have fashioned many yokes during the years he spent as a carpenter. Jesus' listeners certainly would have been familiar with the yoke as a biblical metaphor. And the amazing thing, in Scripture, the yoke is often a common symbol of submission and oppression. In fact, in most cases, when the yoke is employed as a metaphor in Scripture, the sense is usually negative. Even if we just think about it as a mere farm implement, the yoke was a burden. Its function was to enable the animal who wore it to bear someone else's load. So a yoke seems like a most unlikely metaphor to use in conjunction with the promise of rest. Why would Jesus think that this image would hold any appeal to us? And the answer, of course, is that we are already under a yoke. In fact, we are subject to many yokes. Some are yokes that we have crafted for ourselves. Unlike the brute beast who has to be forced by the farmer to take on the yoke, we make our own yokes. And we take them up willingly. There are so many yokes that it really would be impossible for me to highlight them all. Some are so common to us that we don't even think of them as yokes. They're so familiar that we wear them like accessories. Others are more like prisoners' chains. We don't like them, but we don't know how to break free from them. Either way, Jesus makes it clear that the yoke is not something that we can rid ourselves of. This is something that Jesus has to do for us. And what Jesus offers to do is to replace it. But instead of simply trading one load for another, Jesus invites us to trade our burden for a relationship. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, Jesus says in verses 29 and 30. For I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. You might think that the benefit that Jesus promises here would be mutually exclusive from the means that he prescribes. I mean, a yoke hardly seems like a tool for building relationships. In the natural world, the yoke is an instrument of exploitation. The yoke is the means which the farmer uses to gain full advantage of the animal's strength. And for the animal, a yoke is an imposition. It's not a choice. You and I, we are not animals. We don't want to be anybody's beast of burden, not even God's. Notice that Jesus does not deal with us like brute beasts. He does not impose his yoke upon us. He invites us to accept it. He addresses us as volitional beings. Come to me, he says. Take my yoke, he says. At the same time, the metaphor of the yoke makes it clear that we cannot fix ourselves. This is not a recipe for spiritual self-healing. This remedy cannot be self-administered. We come to Christ, but we come to receive. The call to take up the yoke is a call to be acted upon more than it is a call to act. And in fact, the order here is absolutely critical. Because in this metaphor, there is also a clear implication that when we take on the yoke, we also take on a new vocation. The yoke, after all, is made for work. But notice that in Jesus' order, it is rest that comes first. And our problem? Well, our problem is that we have reversed the order. We have come to think that rest issues from work. Many of us rely on our work to give us peace of mind. We look to our work to define who we are. We look to it to order our world and to satisfy our desires. And unfortunately, it has the opposite effect. Now, our problem is more than one of time management. Our struggle to find rest is really a consequence of misaligned confidence. We feel overwhelmed because we have placed our trust in the wrong thing. We depend upon our ability to provide what we need for ourselves, or we rely on the things that we produce. In its ordinary and healthy form, work serves as a means to an end. But in its narcotic form, work no longer serves those who are employed by it. What begins as a means to a legitimate end turns into a distraction and eventually becomes an end in itself. Now, the nature of the task may not have changed at all. The work that we do may itself be virtuous and even necessary. It's our relationship to work that has become destructive. This distortion of work sometimes manifests itself in the addictive behavior known as workaholism. But frankly, it can also reflect an entire approach to life itself. The resulting inversion creates a world where work exists for work's own sake, and where we exist only to work. This is the perspective that theologian Joseph Pieper calls the world of total work. In the world of total work, work is more than a distraction. It is even more than an addiction. In the world of total work, work ultimately becomes a kind of religion. It is a world where a person's worth is measured by their usefulness. It is a world where nobody has intrinsic value. Instead, a person's worth is determined by what they produce. And quite frankly, this is a mentality that has reached far beyond the workplace. It is one which also afflicts the church and is a primary cause of the burden and the weariness that Jesus speaks of in his invitation in Matthew 11. In the church's inverted world of total work, it is not enough for worshipers to contemplate the beauty of Christ. Those who gather for worship must justify their presence by doing something useful. Believers who come to church intent only on worship are treated like spiritual slackers. And meanwhile, congregational worship itself is now being described from the pulpit in terms which suggest that it is the lowest and the least valued form of spiritual devotion. The thinking is that those who come to church just to worship are being selfish. Now, it is certainly possible to be self-centered and self-absorbed when we come to church. But is service really the remedy? In 1 Corinthians 14:26, Paul says that Paul tells the Corinthian church, "What then shall we say, brothers, when you come together? Everyone has a hymn or a word of instruction, a revelation, a tongue, or interpretation. All these must be done for the strengthening of the church." You say, well, there you go. You just contradicted yourself. Listen to Paul. Get busy, he says. Actually, that's not what he's saying. In the context of this statement, it is a criticism as much as it is an observation. Paul had no problem with the church's participatory style, but he did find fault with the self-centered manner in which it was being executed. It is the same spirit that distorted their practice of the Lord's Supper. Apparently, ministry in the Corinthian church was so mixed with egoism that their service did more harm than good. Service, even service in the church, is not a remedy for self-centeredness. The real remedy, believe it or not, is worship. The real remedy is to encounter God The only remedy is to enter into a relationship with God and let Him draw us out of ourselves. Now, busy may certainly be the environment in which we have to live and work at times. It is often a consequence of the responsibilities that come with our callings and our roles. But busyness is not the essence of the Christian life. Despite what we are often told by well-meaning leaders who want to tap into the church's human capital, busier is not better in the Christian life. Busier is not better when busyness bases our relationship with God on performance. And that's the rub. Whenever busyness bases our relationship with God on performance, busier is not better. Busier is dysfunctional. Busier may even be counter to the gospel. When Jesus calls us to take up the yoke of rest in Matthew 11, 28 through 30, He is not really calling us into a different kind of labor. There is work, to be sure. The image of the yoke implies this. We serve Christ. But at its heart, this is really a call to relationship more than it is a call to task. Come to me, Jesus says. Learn from me. I am gentle and humble, Jesus says. You will find rest for your souls. For those whose thinking has been shaped by the world of work, Jesus must seem to have it backwards here. Notice that when Jesus calls us into His service, He does not ask for our resume. He provides us with His. Instead of inquiring about our qualifications, He lists His qualifications. Instead of asking us to demonstrate the added value that we intend to bring to the church, Jesus tells us what He's going to do for us. It is true that rest is a verb as well as a noun. But if rest is an act, it is a special kind of act. Spiritual rest is essentially an exercise in faith. Have you ever considered what you do when you sleep? When we sleep, we lie down and close our eyes because we believe that the world will get along fine without us. We believe that God will take care of us and the world during our slumber. In Psalm 3:5, the psalmist declares, I lie down and sleep. I wake again because the Lord sustains me. Well, like sleep, spiritual rest also begins with surrender. When we rest, we relinquish control. We relinquish control of the world and we resign ourselves to be carried along by a current that is already in motion. This is a current that has been set in motion by God Himself. In the Christian life, rest is synonymous with grace. This means that it must be received before it can be practiced. One of the most frequent questions that I'm asked when I talk about this subject is, well, look, that's all very good and, theological, John. I like that. That's good. But now, exactly, what do I need to do? It's understandable. But it is also a question that betrays a bias in our thinking. As theologian Joseph Pieper observes in his book, Leisure, the Basis for Culture, the inmost significance of the exaggerated value which is set upon hard work appears to be this: man seems to mistrust everything that is effortless. He can only enjoy with a good conscience what he has acquired with toil and trouble. He refuses to have anything as a gift. Years ago, when I worked in a bookstore in a shopping mall, the section toward the back was labeled self-help. And ironically, or perhaps appropriately, the self-help section was always the messiest section in the store, a bit like our lives. And I think it was because the people who went to the self-help section were usually browsing instead of buying. They would leaf through the books, hoping to find a quick solution to their problem. Of course, today we wouldn't even go to a bookstore at all. We would Google our question or look for a how-to video on YouTube. That's because we are living in an age of the life hack and the quick fix. There are thousands of websites, podcasts, and books which promise to provide us with simple steps that will improve and even transform our lives. And sometimes they even work. Unfortunately, the spiritual life tends to be impervious to hacks. It is not easily reduced to 5 steps or simple tricks or quick shortcuts. That's because it is a relationship rather than a method. Take my yoke, Jesus says. Learn from me, Jesus says. I am gentle and humble in heart, Jesus says. This is the language of relationship. This is an invitation into a relationship with God Himself in the person of His Son, Jesus Christ. And that, in essence, is what the yoke of Christ really is. It is not a job description. It is not a task. It is a relationship. To take the yoke of Christ is to submit ourselves to Christ's vision of reality and be transformed by it. It is to acknowledge that we are sinners who cannot fix ourselves and are in need of His grace and forgiveness. But more than anything else, to accept the yoke is to rest. It is to rest from our own works and to receive the righteousness of Christ as our own righteousness. To accept the yoke is to accept Christ. But whenever I say this, people ask me the question that you're thinking of right now. That's good, John. That's great. But what was that again? What is it I'm supposed to do? Martin Luther once said, before you take Christ as an example, you must receive Him as a gift. And the same is true when it comes to rest. The practice of rest is really an exercise in faith. And there certainly are steps that we can take to put us in a better position to experience rest. I mean, we can find a place of solitude. We can turn off the cell phone. We can abstain from social media. We could take refuge in a cave in the wilderness. All of these things might be necessary and even good for us. But it is important to remember that the measures we take do not in themselves cause the rest that we seek. Rest is something that comes to us, as theologian Joseph Pieper says, not without our own efforts, but nevertheless not through our efforts. We can arrange our schedule or structure our environment so that we can wait for rest, but even our best measures, you know this, even our best measures sometimes fail us. We may find that we feel just as harried in our place of solitude as we did in the thick of our daily work. We might leave our job behind only to discover that we are still plagued by worries about it. Consequently, there is more to pursuing rest than simply selecting the right method. The concrete steps that we take or the disciplines that we practice are ways of positioning ourselves so that we are more susceptible to rest. But resting is not itself rest any more than eating is food. Well, some of the best disciplines are those that help us to learn the art of doing nothing. If we're going to be talking about practices, if we're going to talk about disciplines, what I'm really talking about here are disciplines that enable us to engage in retreat, reflection, and rest. This is dedicated space reserved for activity that we do not usually regard as productive. So, in a sense, we're learning how to do nothing. However, they may be productive in an entirely different way. Dallas Willard has defined a spiritual discipline this way. Discipline, strictly speaking, is activity carried on to prepare us indirectly for some activity other than itself. We do not practice the piano to practice the piano well, but to play it. Solitude, Sabbath, and silence are three key disciplines that we can turn to in order to develop the skill of doing nothing. Solitude is foundational because it forces us to step out of the mainstream of action. Solitude interrupts the normal rhythm of our life. But just how do you go about practicing solitude? Well, in one sense, it's not exactly rocket science. You simply remove yourself from the presence of other people for a period of time. Easier said than done. What makes it a discipline is the fact that we do this intentionally and repeatedly. It is not necessary to take extreme measures. A quiet room somewhere comfortable or a walk in the woods might serve. The important thing is that whatever location you choose should actually be conducive to privacy. You won't find much solitude or rest if the kids are fighting in the next room, or if someone is knocking on your door every few minutes, or if that little ding that goes off that tells you that you have another email that's not really worth reading interrupts your solitude. To practice solitude, you need to make yourself unavailable. Turn off the phone. Shut off your computer. Choose a spot that nobody knows about. Now, those of you who are introverts, and it'd be interesting to ask for a show of hands, but you'd be too shy to raise your hand, they will find the practice of solitude that it comes pretty easily to them. Those who are not introverts may find the experience itself too distracting. Some extroverts practice a modified form of solitude by choosing a location where they will be anonymous and unnoticed. They might visit a park or a quiet museum. Well, now that you've found your space, what is supposed to take place in it? Well, in a way, the answer is nothing. Remember, we're practicing the art of doing nothing. The goal is to stop for a time and let the world roll on without us. It doesn't need to produce anything. It doesn't need to create a result. The word that the Bible uses for this practice of intentional unproductivity is Sabbath. But here I am deliberately using the term in the lowercase sense. I am not talking about the biblical observance of the seventh day that was prescribed in the Mosaic law. And nor am I necessarily talking about the weekly observance of a formal day of rest or even of worship, say on Sunday. In this instance, what I mean by Sabbath is an intentional and structured effort to be unproductive. It sounds like a contradiction, I know. How do you make an effort to be unproductive? That doesn't sound like rest, that sounds like work. And for many of us, it is work in the sense that it doesn't come easily to us. We must be intentional if we're going to cease from our normal productive activity. This means that we are not using solitude to catch up on paperwork or our reading or anything else. On other occasions, doing those things might be perfectly fine. But in this instance, we have sought a place of solitude to learn to do nothing. In other words, what we are trying to do is rest. Our aim is to cease from ordinary kinds of activity, which usually serve as a means to an end, and instead engage in something that is an end in itself. We are doing nothing. Now, just as solitude is the kind of context for this, so is silence. And silence is the third discipline I'm trying to underscore. And silence is a very rare commodity in today's world. Many of us employ noise as a shield in our lives. We use noise to detach ourselves from our surroundings and often from the people who are in them. We may even employ sound to build a barrier against our sense of God's presence. Or we use sound to shield ourselves from ourselves. To some extent, it's impossible to experience complete silence unless we achieve it by artificial means. There are always sounds around us. Even in solitude, we hear the distant hum of traffic or the quiet rhythm of our own breathing. Stephen H. Webb points out that silence is not a natural state, and escaping silence is an elusive goal. If we try to hear silence, we will always hear something making noise instead, he writes. Silence, in other words, cannot be the object of intentional activity. The only way to draw silence near is to let go of all intentional activity. But even then, there is a good case to be made that silence is never experienced in its pure state. So maybe our problem is that we're calling this the wrong thing. Perhaps the discipline of silence has been misnamed. It is not a discipline of silence so much as it is the discipline of selective listening. But if we are uncomfortable in solitude, the combination of solitude and silence can be overpowering. Silence, Dallas Willard observes, strips away the barriers that we have thrown up to shield us from the reality of our own life. It reminds us of death, Dallas Willard writes, which will cut us off from this world and leave only us and God. And in that quiet, what if there turns out to be very little to just us and God? Think what it says about the inward emptiness of our lives if we must always turn on the tape player or radio, you get when he was writing this, to make sure something is happening around us. And yet this is partly what we are attempting to confront when we experience silence. Not only do we want to shatter our denial about the true condition of our own lives, but in the process, we hope to discover that our lives were not as empty as we first thought. Although His presence may have been obscured by all the background noise, God has been there all along. Finding that silent space may take some effort. You may have to schedule your solitude or silence for a time when everyone else is asleep in the house, perhaps early in the morning or late at night. You'll also need to be realistic in your estimate of how much time you're going to want to spend in solitude and silence. It is better to start small than to attempt a marathon session. If you're over-ambitious in the beginning, you are liable to become discouraged. You will certainly be bored. Try starting with 5 minutes or less. But do that on a regular basis and slowly increase it until you feel comfortable with the experience. The benefit is in the repeated practice. The benefit is in the repetition, not in the volume of your effort. This is not a contest. We are not trying to earn points. The problems may vary, but the solution always seems to be the same. It's Christ, of course. He's always the answer. He is all-powerful. But sometimes the way that we talk about him gives the impression that his unlimited power will be of little use until we learn how to apply the right mix of Scripture, faith, prayer, and sanctified elbow grease. I sometimes get the feeling when I listen to these sermons that although we are saved by grace, it is our own effort that counts. We are living in the shadowlands of grace, where the line is blurred between what God alone can do for us and what we must do for ourselves. And we have convinced ourselves that the answer to our problems is just to try harder. What we really need is rest. Rest is our destiny. Rest is what we were made for. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, Jesus says, and I